So in the work that Joel has been doing in the Topics on Open Innovation seminar, he is in fact one of my co-authors for a book we did in 2006 with Oxford University Press.
Available from Amazon.
Called Open Innovation, Researching a New Paradigm. And in that volume, we actually, the three of us, Joel, myself, and another gentleman who will be here in November named Wim van Haverbecky, tried to connect the empirical phenomena that we're seeing in industry to some of the academic research. This is back in 2006, as it stood at that time. Since that time, I think Joel continues to work and do research in this area. He's really well known in this area for his research on open source software, but he's done a lot of other stuff too, and I'll let him introduce his research more formally, but it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for the series, Joel West.
It's a pleasure to be here at Cal. Again, I live down in San Jose, and I don't make it up here often enough. And given the interest in technological innovation here at Berkeley, really should be here more often. What I'm going to be talking about today is some academic research that I'm doing here on the topic of open innovation and how it relates to two other streams of innovation, cumulative innovation and diffuse innovation. Has anybody here read, say, a book or article on open innovation? Okay, not a lot.
You can raise those hands proudly when you...
Yeah. User innovation? Okay, so this is a semi-open innovation crowd, but not all. Fair enough. So what I'll do is I'll go through these three different streams of research that sort of developed over the last 20 years on the topics related to the production of innovation, effectively production of innovation outside the boundary of a firm or across the boundaries of the firm. And then talk about why it is we think it's an interesting question to combine these into perhaps some sort of integrated framework or some sort of contrasting framework. And sprinkle them through it with examples as they go along. Now, I have enough material to fill, to leave room for at least a half an hour worth of questions. So if you want to ask something as I go along, just feel free to chime in either for clarification or to maybe if there's something that's not clear. I think in terms of maybe engaging discussion, we'll kind of move that to the back end to make sure that we have time for everybody at the end. Okay, so what's the point of what I want to talk about for the next hour? Our argument here is that there are really these different communities and these different streams of research that are looking at related phenomena in similar but not quite the same way. And it turns out when you dig deep into them that there's a lot of agreement between them on some important issues, but on the other hand, there are some much more visible disagreements that everybody knows about, which we boil down to two basic ideas. One of which is they're looking at different things, and then the second is that they're sort of motivated by or incorporating different assumptions. So I want to kind of use this as a way to contrast these literatures, and then talk about why we think that thinking about it this way maybe helps us both understand the phenomena of innovation as it occurs outside organizational boundaries, and also how this might influence how researchers think about innovation studies going forward. Okay, so we thought one of the interesting places to start would be to say what is innovation, because unfortunately in these studies they don't actually tend to define it. They just assume that everybody knows what innovation is. And so there's sloppiness would be too strong. I think perhaps there's sort of a tacit assumption that everybody knows what you mean and they're not really nailing it down. So I want to kind of start with this because I feel you really need to kind of be doing apples and apples comparison. So even if you look in the innovation literature, there's not really a definition of what innovation is. You go to dictionaries, you go to the encyclopedia, you go to papers. There's a lot of disagreement about what innovation is. Creativity, it turns out, is a much easier term to define than innovation, and for reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So effectively, some of the areas where people don't agree on what innovation means is that some people talk about it as exclusively a technical process or a technical creation. Some talk about it as really only relevant when it has an economic component, which I'll get to in a minute. Some sort of see it at the intersection of these two things. There's some that say the only innovations that count are radical innovations, ones that really are significant. Others say anything, no matter how trivial is an innovation. Some people talk about innovation from the standpoint of people who adopt innovation. So Everett Rogers, in his classic series of books, The Diffusion of Innovations, he made a career out of looking at how individuals or firms adopt innovations, whereas others, people like myself or Henry, look at more, well, how do firms create innovations? Because if they don't create innovations, then they won't be able to sell them, they won't be able to get price premiums for them, and so on. And then finally, there's certainly a sense in the new product development literature of this distinction between new to the firm versus new to the world. So is this the first time somebody's done it, or is it just the first time we've done it? And so that famous scholar, Henry Chesbrough, he was a Harvard professor back then, or were you a Berkeley doctor? You were a Harvard professor back then. And Dick Rosenbluth said that essentially the value of a technology is really latent until it's commercialized in some way. And I think this is the sort of definition we're most comfortable with, but there's a problem with that, which I'll come back to in a minute. And so they argue that essentially the whole reason you need to care about business models and 4 years later buy the book Open Business Models is because the business model is what unlocks that latent value. It's what sort of spans the technical domain and the economic domain. So in that regard, this is a useful definition for us because it essentially says there is a technical domain, there is an economic domain, and there's some sort of overlap or joining or connection between the two of those, and that connection is made through the business model. And I'm teasing Hank a little bit about his book because effectively you can see antecedents of both the open innovation books that Hank did and also his work on business models in this sort of conception of business models that was published in 2002. And similarly, Chris Freeman, who's one of the most influential innovation economists of the 20th century, basically said, you know, you can have an invention, but it's not an innovation in any sort of economic sense unless it's commercialized. So these are two kind of fairly standard, respected definitions of sort of why innovation has to have this sort of economic or commercial element to it. And there's just one little problem here, which is to say a lot of what the user innovation literature in particular looks at is non-commercial deployment or diffusion of innovation. So if in fact two hobbyists share their ideas, this might not actually count as an economic innovation in the Chesbrough or Freeman sense. But in every other way, it might be indistinguishable from processes that we're interested in. So I think the Ed Roberts definition is the one we're kind of most comfortable with, which is to say innovation is a two-part process. It's the invention, and then it's the conversion of that invention into something that's useful. So it's a little bit less about making money, but it still has this idea that thinking up some great idea that doesn't actually get used isn't really all that important to society or the economy or to for academic study. So we have this famous slide that Hank was so nice to make out for us about 3 or 4 years ago, and we've all stolen ever since. It's actually out of chapter 1 of the book that we did, where he said, look, the idea is that you've got this science and technology base. This is sort of core technologies that are things like academic research, published papers, prior art and patents, and so on. You have the firm doing its research investigations here, generally, although not exclusively limited to applied research. You develop this into products, and then you bring the products to market. And this is the traditional sort of mid-20th century conception of how R&D is, how technology is invented, how it's commercialized, how it's brought to market. And so, in fact, for those of us who are business historians, you know, our prophet here is Alfred DuPont Chandler. Late Al Chandler made his career out of essentially studying large firms, initially U.S. firms, later multinational firms, and looking at why the firms come into existence, how they basically create a way to take invention and turn it into a business. Because if you look at it, there's a lot of, you know, Leonardo da Vinci. There's a lot of invention going on for hundreds of years before the 20th and 19th centuries. But it isn't necessarily translating into financial success for those who create these inventions. And so what Chandler is capturing is this transition from invention as a solitary act or something that individuals do because they're curious into a business activity that's basically supported by people who are going to make money off the invention. So this is what Chandler was looking at. Things like, for example, German dye stuffs, you know, that we've had dyes throughout human history, 5,000, 10,000 or more years, because it's a valuable way to create cloths of different colors. But the Germans in the late 19th century and early 20th century figured out new ways to create dyes that were perhaps more permanent and more unique colors. And this was the basis of all the German chemical companies that grew up during this period, people like Bayer. And so therefore, what Chandler's looking at is essentially how is it that these firms get created to do research and development and then have these large labs to just do basic research, to do applied research, and to bring that to market. And one of the things that's different between the Chandler view of what was going on 100 years ago and the Chesbrough view of what should be going on in the 21st century is that you really don't have efficient markets for buying and selling innovation. So if you want to invent something, the only way you're going to make money out of it is to bring that product to market yourself. And so this is effectively, this would be a, I suppose this would be a Williamson argument that, if markets don't work, then you have to incorporate it into the boundaries of the corporation. So essentially, this is the view of how, and this is the reality of how large industrial firms are working before World War II and immediately after World War II, probably up at least through the 60s, because they're funding this research and also because they need a way to bring this research to market. Now, we'll be talking later on. There's sort of a knowledge story to this paper, and as Hank suggested, there may be more than one paper here, so we're trying to find our focus here. But one of the things that we found in sort of trying to tie these innovation stories back to what we know about the role of knowledge and creativity and so on is that really innovation tends to tie back to one of two things or some combination thereof. One possibility is that you have scarce knowledge, that not everybody has the knowledge, and therefore the people who have the knowledge are able to create innovations when people don't. So for example, in my own work, I'm doing a book on the transformation of the communications industry from analog to digital in the roughly 1970s, 1980 timeframe. And it turns out there are a bunch of people who got cranked out of MIT who were oriented toward these ideas of Claude Shannon and how to commercialize them in a way that was not broadly understood at that time. And so if you have a new technology, a radical innovation, it may be that there are people who do have the knowledge and people who don't have the knowledge. And so therefore there are opportunities for people to make money off of things when this knowledge is scarce. But a more normal or customary domain for innovation is this idea where the knowledge is actually widely dispersed. And what you're doing is you're building a better mousetrap by building on the pieces that everybody has available, but you have some insight that nobody previously had. I mean, I don't think that Pierre Almadar really was the only one who conceived of creating an online marketplace that became eBay. But what you have is you essentially have somebody who says, okay, here is how we could combine these various ideas, these various enabling technologies, and turn this into a business in a way that was possible for others. But eBay was created by one specific individual or group that saw that possibility of combining these things. And then finally, one of the things that's kind of frustrating us, and we're still trying to work through, is in some of the research there's a fuzzing between this idea of creativity and innovation. And some people say, if it's anything creative, it counts as innovation. Well, if you're going to define innovation, then innovation includes some things and not other things. And so what we would rather say is that there are parallels between creativity and innovation. We'll come back to them later. But a lot of things like, for example, Larry Lessig, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, when he talks about music sampling or Creative Commons and recombining artwork and whatnot, this is a parallel process to innovation, but we really shouldn't stretch the term innovation so broadly that it picks up hip-hop artists writing new songs, or book authors, or journalists. And so there are certainly parallels. The generation of something new and valued is certainly parallel to innovation, but it's not really the same thing as technological innovation. All right. So then what I want to do is sort of with those definitions in hand, I want to look at these three major streams of distributed perspectives on innovation, or what Niklas Frank refers to as distributed innovation. Since we have a lot of buzzwords already, I'm a little reluctant to plant my stake in the ground and coin a new buzzword. So we'll just say these are distributed views of innovation. And sort of going through the one perspective I talked about, vertical integration, with these three perspectives that I will be talking about: user innovation, cumulative innovation, open innovation. Effectively, vertical integration says, look, if we're going to bring a product, technology to market, it's a technology that we developed. And user innovation, all of these kind of say, okay, the firm can bring its own technologies to market. User innovation has said, our customers have ideas, and we need to bring their ideas to market. And there's a little bit of early work of Eric von Hippel, who created this, that talks about the role of suppliers, but in general, that's been sort of de-emphasized. The work of Suzanne Scotchmer, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, and a number of others on cumulative innovation, they sort of focus on the flows of ideas and sources of knowledge and innovations between direct competitors. And finally, open innovation is the big tent. There was some concern that it was going to try to take over the world because it's a grand unified theory that subsumes everything, but as I'll talk about in a few minutes, there definitely are some things that it doesn't cover. But the idea of open innovation is, hey, there are innovations everywhere in the world. Let's take them wherever we can find them and make some money off of them. We don't care where they come from. What we care about is how we can translate them into some sort of business model for profit for the firm. So just, okay, you can kind of see. Can you see that? Okay, so it's I always worry about these color contrasts, whether they're going to work. So this is sort of a stylized view of what we would call a value network, or sort of a simplified business ecosystem, in which we have the relationships between a number of firms. And so, for example, if you think about this as being personal computers, this might be Dell, this might be HP, this might be Intel or Microsoft, these might be individual consumers or business users, and these might be producers of things like application software or computer printers or LCD screens or things like that. So essentially, I just want to give you sort of this way of thinking about the relationships of firms in a complex system where you have value creation by a number of different firms. And each of these boxes, of course, are not necessarily one firm. They could represent a group of firms that are similarly situated. But I want to give you this framework to sort of make the story about the difference between the three streams of innovation. And so the work of Eric von Hippel at MIT is basically around a simple idea, which is users know their needs best. And kind of a second point that he makes related to that is that for whatever reason, that knowledge doesn't necessarily get translated into actionable ideas for firms, because they are not, for example, able to articulate these ideas. They won't know it until they try it out. So he talks about this idea of sticky information, that people have an idea of how to solve a problem, and they can't really transfer that idea of how to solve the problem. So the best thing to do is put tools in their hand so they can solve the problem themselves. And so most of the work on user innovation has some element of user creation. Empower these users to solve their own problem with things like toolkits. There is an element of feedback, but some of that feedback is really standard market research 101. Listen to your users, ask them what they want. But effectively what the research is focused on is the processes and the tools and the design of innovation, of systems to enable this sort of user innovation. And this is probably the most vibrant of the three research streams, at least measured in terms of number of people, number of articles. There's a whole von Hippel Society. They don't call it the von Hippel Society. It's the user innovation community. But effectively, there are dozens of doctoral students in Europe, mostly in German-speaking countries for some reason, doing dissertations on things related to this. And then part of it is, of course, is Eric's initial book, The Sources of Innovation in 1980. It's been around for almost 30 years. Sorry, it's been around for more than 20 years. And so therefore, it's sort of had the biggest head start. And one of the big sort of fault lines or subdivisions within this user innovation research is there's different ideas about what happens to this user knowledge. For example, if you give a user a tool, maybe they'll solve their problem and that's all they're going to do. So there's been a number of studies on user innovation in sporting goods. So if you're in a competitive sailboat class and people have tools available off the shelf to modify the sailboat, it may not be in your interest to tell your competitors how it is you made your boat faster than theirs. You're just going to use the off-the-shelf tools to get an extra tenth of a second or two seconds off of your time by tweaking some element of the sail or the boom or the water line or something like that. So one of the things that users might do is they might not reveal their innovations. They want the tools to innovate, but they're going to keep them to themselves. And this is obviously less economically interesting than the other cases because effectively it has a very localized impact. A lot of the emphasis in user innovation literature is on this idea of free revealing, that I have an idea and I want to reveal it to others and not actually try to make a buck off it. Dietmar Haarhoff and his colleagues, including von Hippel, sort of did a mathematical exegesis of this idea of under what conditions would users actually freely reveal their ideas. And they might reveal their ideas to their friends, their colleagues, members of a community. We would now talk about an innovation community. Or in fact, they might give them back to the companies. So for example, I have revealed a lot of ideas to software companies because when I find a problem in their software or I find a limitation of their software, I would just assume that they fix it and ship it to me in the next version than for me to figure out some elaborate way to modify their software and be stuck maintaining it for the rest of my life. And so in that regard, I have a very narrow utility idea, which is if I give it away, I can't monetize it myself anyway. So if I give it away, it will become part of the supported baseline product, and therefore it's very much in my interest to give this idea back to somebody who's in a position to develop and support it. And then there's a third sort of substream, probably the smallest substream of the user innovation literature, which says, hey, this idea, we've got it, it's unique, it's novel, it has to do with our unique insights, let's make money off of it some way. And so some of this is, hey, I'm a user, I'm going to try to sell it back to companies. But a lot of it is companies pay money to users to get them to surface their ideas. Have like an idea contest. Or you have something like Threadless, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But you know, where essentially you have people come up with new ideas and you run some sort of contest and give money to the best ideas or give recognition to the best ideas. And so this is one way to monetize it. And then the most extreme example is there's some very recent research which talks about how users who have pain points and have problems, they solve the problems. Nobody's making a product that solves this problem, so they create a company to solve this problem. And so Sonali Shah and Mary Tripsis did a study of basically mommies and daddies who solve baby problems. You know, things like special slings or jogging strollers or other types of products where you had an educated set of consumers who couldn't find a product that solved their problem, and so they decided that rather than try to convince a large bureaucratic organization to bring their product to market, that they would create a new organization to bring these products to market. Okay, the second stream of research is perhaps most closely associated with Suzanne Scotchmer. I can't tell from the website if she's with the economics department here at Berkeley or the law school, because she has a joint appointment and it's not clear which. Sorry? Yeah, she's in both. She's kind of got a foot in both camps. So her office seems to be at Bolt and her mailing address seems to be at economics. So anyway, this is probably the most underappreciated of the three streams. It's come into its own realm in the last couple of years through some work by Fiona Murray of MIT. But essentially what her work and the work that she builds on and the other work in this area tends to look at is you have something that's brand new, that's never been done before. And so the person who makes the first one of the widget, like for example, imagine the airplane in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that the first product really isn't a product, it's more of an invention, it's not really done. And so you've got a lot of people working on this problem and they're either sharing intentionally or otherwise. And so the only way you can get a solution to the problem is through all these minds working in a dispersed fashion to try to solve it. And so one of the examples that Scotchmer and some of the others talk about, for example, is the development of the laser in sort of the 1950s, 1960s, where a lot of work is being done in various places. And so Scotchmer being sort of being an IP economist is essentially looking at, well, what are the rules that we want to have to enable this sort of people building on each other, even though they may not be intentionally collaborating? And so, in fact, we need to have rights to build on each other's works, and that some approaches to IP, like for example, a very strict patent system, may make it hard for firms to build upon each other. And so there's the classic example, the early 20th century, that the inventor of the diode, which was a tube, by the way, not a semiconductor device. The inventor of the diode tube and the inventor of the triode tube were rivals. And it turns out the diode tube wasn't very useful. The triode tube was more useful. But the diode inventor wouldn't license his technology for making triodes, and the triode inventor wouldn't license his technology to the diode person so he could make triodes. So basically there were no triodes sold in the United States until the diode patent expired. So this is an example from the early 20th century of cases where you have sort of a mutual prisoner's dilemma on collaborative innovation. And so one of the things that we have noticed that they don't tend to talk about is there are really two different versions of this collaborative innovation story. One of which is sort of a can't we all get along? You know, we're all friends, yes, we're trying to make a buck, but we'll pool our knowledge, we'll share, we'll definitely know that there's leakage between us. And some of the studies of the creation of the airplane in the late 19th century or 20th century suggest that there may be some of that going on. And then there's the sort of bitter rivalry that one of us is going to make a buck off of this, and whoever gets there first, and we'll steal ideas from all of our competitors as best we can, and may the best man win kind of view. So but both of them kind of talk about these flows between direct competitors. And Scotchmer made a really interesting point that I want to sort of build on, which is to say there are a lot of different ways that this knowledge can flow. One of the simplest and best known ones is this idea that you have some core enabling technology that sort of controls access to everything that comes after it. So the best example of this, particularly at the University of California, although it's San Francisco across the bay, is the Cohen-Boyer patent, where Cohen and Boyer from Stanford and Berkeley invented recombinant DNA. And so all sorts of stuff done with recombinant DNA for the next 15 to 20 years depends on the Cohen-Boyer patent. It makes Stanford and the UC system quite rich. Then you have other things where you have essentially a product that has to build on a lot of existing technologies and may require access to those technologies. And so if you have a typical, like an iPhone or some other smartphone out there, it has GSM technologies, it has WCDMA technologies, it may have an MP3 player, it may have a camera phone, and there's patents and royalties associated with all of those. And so essentially you can't build one of these unless you can get access to all these pieces. And every time the toll collector charges you a charge, that sort of raises the cost of making one of these goods. And then finally, the case that kind of we're most interested here is this sort of quality race, where essentially the airplane, Wright brothers do 1903, and then some of the competitors come out in 1905. The Wright brothers are building on the work of others in the late 19th century, where everybody's trying to do the same thing, and each incremental improvement is slightly better. And if each person can stop their successors from innovating, then you don't have rapid improvement. By the same token, if people can't make money off of their incremental improvements, then there's no business in it. And so since I was with my software company, we were making software for inkjet printers. If you look at what Seiko and Canon and HP were doing in the 80s and 90s in terms of making inkjet printer heads, they all have a lot of patents here, and they're all kind of building on each other's work. And in their particular case, they solved the problem with a patent cartel. They basically said, we'll form a cartel, we'll cross-license. And if you're not Canon or Seiko Epson or HP, you're going to have a hard time making an inkjet printer because you don't have any of those patents. But these three basically agreed to pool their patents, or at least to cross-license in such a way that they could do these incremental improvements. And last but certainly not least, here at the Shrine to Open Innovation, we have the idea of open innovation with the 3 Chesbrough books shown there, and of course a number of papers, many of which are on the Open Innovation website. And so what are the key ideas of open innovation? Really, it's twofold, which is we can get other sources of innovation other than in the firm. We don't have to be Chandler or the DuPont Chemical or one of these vertically integrated firms. And most of the work in open innovation looks at markets for innovation. Let's go buy innovation out in the market. But if you look at Chesbrough, I believe it's the Sloan Management paper in 2003, he refers also to this idea of innovation benefactors, which is to say, if somebody's giving away innovation, we'll certainly use it. There's no reason not to take it. But so this isn't quite symmetrical, because this is basically saying we'll buy innovation or we'll take free innovations if people are giving them away. And then this is basically saying, well, if we have innovations, maybe our commercializing it isn't the best way to do it. And the Xerox PARC example, which led to the Chesbrough and Rosenblum 2002 paper, was an example of, Xerox PARC is inventing all these things, but they really don't fit a copier company. And so they needed to find some way to turn them into businesses, because things like inventing laser printers turn out to have economic value if you can find a way to bring them to market. And so that's where they came up with this concept of the central role of the business model in developing and commercializing these different approaches to innovation. And then one of the things that I think is underappreciated is that a lot of what the open innovation work is about is this idea of a cognitive paradigm, which is to say, think about open innovation differently. It's not that we're necessarily doing the practice differently, it's the prioritization, it's the metrics, it's the incentives, rather than necessarily completely radically changing the practice. And in some firms, it's a radical change in practice, in others it's not. And then finally, as I sort of alluded to with that table, there are aspects of it which are very consonant with the user and cumulative innovation perspectives. So this is sort of the other Chesbrough diagram that I steal shamelessly in every other presentation, but it is credited to the first chapter of the Chesbrough et al. Book, where Chesbrough says, look, we can have our own we have technology that we use from outsiders. We have our own internal technology. We do our R&D, and maybe that turns into things that we license. Maybe that turns into new spin-off companies, and maybe along the way, instead of create our own technology, we buy technology in the open market. So all these things, the sort of purple arrows, are things that you're doing in open innovation that you wouldn't have done in Chandler's View or the classic DuPont or Bayer chemical type of perspective. You did want to see the word West up here on one of the slides, so I had to strain to use this one. But this was the reinterpretation of open innovation that Scott Gallagher and I did, where we basically said there are three key issues for open innovation. One of which is, we've invented something, what's the best way to make money off of it? And so if we're going to go outside the market, how are we going to maximize the returns for commercializing this in the market rather than commercializing it through our own product? Yeah, this is sort of the default, that's supposed to say R&D, I guess you can sort of see it. This is the default vertically integrated path. So for open innovation, which is either bringing in technology from outside or sending our technology to the outside world, one of the things is, how do we maximize the return of these things that R&D come up with? The second is, how do we find outside technologies and actually get these technologies into the firm? And so Chesbrough talks about the not-invented here syndrome, which is certainly rampant in tech companies for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. We didn't invent this technology, we're not really interested in putting in our products. And this is a clear cognitive problem or incentives problem of getting this involved. And the third thing that we focused on was that if you're buying innovations, then you can throw money at people and you assume you'll get a supply of innovation. That's what free markets are. But there may be other ways to motivate a supply of innovations that don't involve money, things like recognition for people who do game modifications, for example. So there may be other strategies to more abstract this problem and more generally try to get a supply of outside innovations, not just through pecuniary means. Okay, given the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are some other models that kind of look similar but aren't the same. We're teasing these out. One of which is this idea of open science. And so the work of Robert Merton, among others, Paul David at Stanford, talk about this cumulative knowledge production, but it's not really about monetizing it or commercializing it. But definitely this idea of flows and collaboration and cooperation and competition is very much at the heart of open science. And then free software, which is almost a communitarian model, basically says, look, we're going to share the production and we're going to share the output of this. And so again, there are some overlaps between this and the sort of the theoretical streams that we talked about. And then finally, to kind of come back to Larry Lessig, who was at Stanford until Harvard made him a better offer. Larry Lessig, with his work on cumulative, Creative Commons, had kind of been focusing on this idea of the creative industries and how can we encourage incremental improvements and building on each other in collaboration. And so Creative Commons and open source software, both of which are about creativity, and unless things that are covered by copyright, not things that are covered by patents, are about this sort of distributed innovation process, but they're not strictly speaking about technological innovation. And so the idea of the dispersal of production and information and knowledge is similar, and the cumulative production are similar, but they kind of have different ways that the value is created and value is captured. Okay, so I want to briefly talk about the similarities and then highlight what we think are the two major differences of these models, and then talk at the end about the implications. And hopefully, we want to be done by, what, 3:10, so we can have 20 minutes for questions? Is that what we should for? Okay, I think we should be in fine shape. Okay, so one of the things that these ideas have is this basic understanding that knowledge is dispersed. So this is, Bill Joy's idea that not all the smart people in the world work for us is one way of putting it. But more rigorously, that useful knowledge is widely distributed and of high quality. Or von Hippel, that different users and manufacturers will have different stocks of information, and people will tend to innovate with the knowledge that they have. And so in all of these, they kind of have a very different model than the vertically integrated model. The vertically integrated model is we want to try to get all the ideas into our building, into our organization, and control them and own them, and keep others from having them. And these kind of say, look, that ain't going to happen, it can't be done, and we ought to have a model of innovation that allows for the fact that that can't be done, and this can't be done. Some other similarities, don't have the pithy quotes, but that for firms, all of these have require firms to think more about what's happening going on outside the firm, as opposed to the vertically integrated model, which is very inwardly focused. Most of these talk about innovation that occurs somehow spanning firm boundaries, open innovation that's explicit, cumulative innovation that's sort of spillovers between firms. And some of the user innovation work doesn't even care if firms exist or not. So I don't want to overgeneralize there. But certainly, for example, if users are sharing with firms, that's crossing firm boundaries. And overall, they're rejecting the sort of very pipeline view of vertical integration, which frankly, if you take a new product development course 10, 15 years ago, even that late, you still would have gotten the pipeline model of how products get developed. We have ideas, we stamp them through, we funnel them down, we weed out some. I mean, this is the way that people were taught to develop products, and this is why the open innovation and user innovation models are so radical in their implications for product development. And so we kind of came up with this Venn diagram. This is more illustrative than sort of some strong theoretical statement. But the point we're trying to make is that there are some things that are unique in the conceptions of each of the user innovation, open innovation, and cumulative innovation. There are some things that are definitely overlapping between two of them, and in fact, this idea of knowledge being diffuse is sort of a common subset among all of them. So essentially, user innovation and cumulative innovation tend to bias towards a policy regime with weak intellectual property, which typically would be expressed in terms of patent strength. Both user innovation and open innovation are quite keen in sort of engaging the knowledge of users in the innovation process. The open innovation and cumulative innovation, the actors are profit-seeking firms, so they have a sort of a similar assumption about how this is going on, whereas user innovation juxtaposed against that is really more about users' personal utility. Users, by the way, could be individuals, they could be user firms. And similarly, cumulative innovation is really about this idea of rivalrous knowledge, sort of knowledge that in which firms are trying to compete to have this knowledge in this sort of same domain. Okay, so the two sort of areas which we think are sort of major differences across OUCI. By the way, again, I'm not trying to coin a new term. Just internally, I've been using OUCI for over 2 years. But part of it is because my PhD is from UCI. So that acronym works better for me than UOCI or COUI or something else. So just easier for me to remember. So anyway, across OUCI, one of the things is that they're looking at different phenomena. So while they agree, for example, on dispersed pools of knowledge, and in fact that knowledge will be flowing between the various actors, as I'll talk about in a minute, there's this idea in the knowledge, in the commercialization of knowledge, that knowledge may flow as information, as sort of raw data. It may flow in terms of licensed IP, or it may in fact flow as a product. So if you buy If you buy a laptop with an Intel chip, some of Intel's knowledge is in fact in that laptop. You don't actually get to do much with it, but you get the benefit of it. And so therefore you're paying directly or indirectly for Intel to develop that knowledge. And so all the OUCI literature is really kind of is on the same page on that. What they tend to differ on is these three ideas, which is to say sort of what knowledge is interesting. So where is this interesting knowledge? How does it actually get commercialized or diffused more broadly? And then the third thing is there's sort of a normative or recommended or policy type angle to it, which is, well, which should we encourage, or what's good, or what is it that we value as researchers or as academics or as practitioners? And so, for example, Ternatsky and Fleischer talk about how that really technologies are knowledge-based. This is the link between sort of this idea of knowledge and technological innovation. This is sort of a broad literature which says that at some level knowledge is at the heart of the process of technological innovation. So sort of going back to that simplified industry model, what we have is that open innovation is to a large degree, although not exclusively, about saying, hey, we have outsiders who are providing technology to us. They may be providing technology to our competitors. They may be providing the technology as licensed IP, or they may be selling us components. I mean, Apple doesn't make its own microprocessors. HP doesn't make its own microprocessors. They buy them outside of the market. That's a very open innovation way of looking at things. Similarly, if you're Microsoft, you don't actually make computers. You license your technology, your operating system technology, to firms that will bring it to market. So that's an open innovation view. The user innovation view is very user-centric, not surprisingly. So users are sharing their knowledge. They're sending them back to producers, or they could even be sending them back to firms that make complements. And then the cumulative innovation model is essentially looking at the flows of knowledge between the firm that we're interested in, if we're at Dell, and direct competitors. Okay, so these literatures have sort of different ontologies of knowing. So who knows? Well, in vertical integration, the motto is, we know best. And user innovation, of course, users are God, users know best. And open innovation is, we don't care who they are, we'll find the specialists and we'll go to them because they're the ones that know best. And cumulative innovation has an implied story that nobody really knows best. Nobody has the whole story, and that the only way you can actually solve a problem is to build on the knowledge of everybody else. And so, not surprisingly, the views of how to use knowledge for innovation that flow from this are pretty natural. So vertically integrated firms use internal knowledge. Open innovation firms are trying to be agnostic between knowledge inside and outside the firm. User innovation is essentially saying, hey, knowledge doesn't travel very well. It's sticky. It tends to be with the person who holds it. Long argument about whether it's sticky information or sticky knowledge, but von Hippel says, well, sometimes it's not really even codified or to the point where we want to dignify it with the term knowledge, but it's still valuable even as just sort of raw and processed information. And so the idea of innovation is expect it to happen at the place where that information or knowledge is, because it doesn't travel well. And finally, cumulative innovation is very much about sort of building on the combined knowledge of many actors. And that's the sort of the innovation model that it assumes. And so if you look at this, essentially what we have is we've got, okay, it's the firm controls its own knowledge and the flows of knowledge and the revealing or the sharing of knowledge and the ownership of knowledge is all kept within the firm. And open innovation is wherever we can find it, it crosses boundaries. Generally, people will share knowledge with us if we pay them, or we will share our knowledge if people pay us. And in order to be able to have markets for IP, then we need to have some sort of IP process. User innovation, really the idea is users have the knowledge and it flows from users. And generally, although not entirely, they're freely revealing their knowledge. And so therefore, if we're free revealing, ownership is really less of a central question. Finally, cumulative innovation says, hey, we've got dispersed knowledge, we've got spillovers, and this knowledge is flowing all different ways between various firms that are trying to do the same thing. All right. And the second area that we look at is the issue of motivation. And one of the sort of core things when you read this literature, in fact, it makes it almost impossible to present an open innovation paper in front of a user innovation audience, or vice versa, is they really have different ideas of what it is that is success. I mean, user innovation is, hey, we want innovations to be created, and there is some sort of sense that most of the literature is focused on quantity. We don't care how good they are, we just want lots of them. More recently, people have been trying to document the emergence of important innovations or valuable innovations or innovations that have an impact. Cumulative innovation, the success measure is technological progress. You know, we're sitting here in 1870, and there's no heavier than air aircraft, and by 1950, 1970, you know, Germans and French and Brits are dropping bombs out of airplanes on infantrymen. They have an aircraft that's reliable enough to send over a battlefield and to use in combat. So therefore, the cumulative innovation story is usually we didn't have something and we did have something later on, and how did we get there? Whether it's a laser or an airplane or a blast furnace or something else. And finally, open innovation is shamelessly firm-centric. We want firms to make piles of money. So I guess that must be the David Teesing influence sneaking through there. But effectively, it's a corporate, you know, it's a firm product strategy kind of view, which is to say, you know, what can firms do to either increase their profit or reduce their risk by using open innovation processes rather than vertically integrated processes. And so similarly, if you look at this from a sociological standpoint, essentially you have norms of cooperation in user innovation, of competition in cumulative innovation, of an exchange based on market in open innovation. And then you look at free software, it's about sharing. And if you look at open science, there's sort of norms of professionalism and you know, academic expectations. You've got different motivations. You know, the cumulative innovation, open innovation are similar in terms of expecting that the actors are trying to make money, whereas free software, a lot of the work is either about people are doing it because they enjoy it or because they believe in a cause. And open science, kind of to some degree overlapping also with free software, there's a reputational motive, that you're signaling your value to an outside audience. So I'm standing here signaling my value to all the people who go to the Center for Open Innovation website and see this webcast, and Joel West is some sort of thought leader in open innovation. And then finally, you know, the model of how innovation is produced, I can't really sort of get my arms around user innovation. It tends to be sort of a solitary view, but that would probably be too simplistic. Cumulative innovation is definitely people building on each other. Open innovation, if you're buying technologies from wherever you get them, you're saying, I own this, I buy this, I put it all together and make some sort of solution that uses the best possible inputs from wherever we can get them. Free software is very much of a norm of cooperation, and open science is really not concerned generally with commercialization. In fact, in some ways, it rejects the idea of commercialization entirely. So one of the core ideas coming back to this is, you know, can the people who innovate make money off the flows of knowledge from their innovations? And so open innovation and user entrepreneurship about, hey, shamelessly, yes, we should make money off of these flows. That's why we exist, is to make money off the flows of knowledge. Whereas cumulative innovation says, there's going to be so much knowledge flowing, and it's not really going to be practical to control it all, so let's just kind of let it spill over. And in the end, it'll, you know, may the best firm win in terms of bringing a product to market. And user innovation, which explicitly encourages people to share knowledge. And then the second thing is that, you know, should they try to monetize the flows? And here, sort of open innovation stands alone, which kind of makes it difficult. But dangerous to make an open innovation talk in a user innovation conference, because open innovation is very much about, yes, firms should try at all opportunities to monetize their flows. Whereas cumulative innovation, open science basically argue that these monetized flows impair innovation and scientific progress and so on. And free software people see it as being morally repugnant to try to make money off the software. So here, at least from an ideological standpoint, open innovation is kind of on its own. Although open innovation is quite happy to take free spillovers from outsiders if they want to let them spill over. Okay, so let me kind of wrap this up with some sort of issues that we're still wrestling with that we think are interesting problems. And so we have these disagreements of these various theories, and some elements of the disagreements, maybe they don't matter. I mean, if there's a phenomenon that's being studied by user innovation and it's not really part of open innovation, you really couldn't call it open innovation, then we don't expect the theory of cell division to necessarily sync with the theory of gravity. I mean, we have disjoint pools of scientific knowledge and phenomena we're covering, and so the degree to which these different theories are studying different things, each has its own realm and its own its application. The interesting thing is when they overlap, and what we're trying to get our arms around is, are they making conflicting predictions? In which case we could test them. As social scientists, we could say, hey, we'll go out and do a test, and we'll take the user innovation prediction, and we'll take the open innovation prediction, and which ones works better? Or are there conflicting values? Is this more about how the world works, or is this more about how the world should work? And there seems to be a little bit of element of both in this. And so, for example, here's some things. I'm just picking on user innovation because it was the easiest one, that are user innovation, but you might argue they're not user innovation. So, for example, if users go out and create firms based on their own knowledge of a need, well, the user innovation people would say this is user innovation because users have knowledge, it's sticky, it doesn't transmit, so we'll go ahead and make a firm to commercialize it. And Al Chandler would say, hey, somebody wants to make a better mousetrap, they have the knowledge of how to make a better mousetrap, they create a company that makes better mousetraps. How's that different than any other vertically integrated firm that we've known about for 150 years? And similarly, something like Threadless, which is, they run the t-shirt design contest. Again, user innovation people would say, well, users have the knowledge and we're trying to get them to share their knowledge. But I might argue they're not really solving their own problem. This is really not scratching your own itch in the way that user innovation is normally sold. And in fact, in many cases, such as Threadless, this user-generated content isn't freely revealed. They're being paid to do this. So if you're paying people outside who have knowledge, that looks to me a lot like open innovation, which actually we argued in our chapter in this book, because we looked at open source in that regard. And then finally, open source. The open source people talk about, well, this is scratching an itch. A developer is solving his own problem. But we can also look at something like, say, Linux or the Eclipse, or a number of other large open source projects in which firms are providing the resources to it. And we can say, look, this is really a form of pooled R&D. Firms are paying for the provision for paying to develop an input that they're going to share the input, and that this is really a commercial activity. This is not, this is not scratching an itch. Of course, these may be different parts of the open source story. That might be one reconciliation. So why would we care? I mean, other than, maybe I'm an academic, I want to get a paper published, I have to say something new, so therefore I can claim this is contribution. But what's the practical value of doing it? Well, these different theories have different assumptions about where innovation comes from and how it is that you motivate the creation of this knowledge and how do you motivate the diffusion of this knowledge. And so therefore, if you say this phenomenon is user innovation or you say this phenomenon is open innovation, you might actually make you might be looking for sources of innovation or ways of bringing innovation to market in different ways. So it would be different managerial advice for firms. Where do you find your innovations? How do you make money off of innovation? Certainly there are differences on policy prescriptions, particularly things about IP policy. But really you can't do anything about innovation which isn't come back down, particularly with politicians and university presidents and NSF and whatnot, all has an economic impact. The Japanese government, the Swedish government, and the French government, and the EU, and they spend a lot of money studying innovation, not because it's intellectually interesting, but because it creates economic growth. And so therefore, sources of innovation and how they get diffused and turned into businesses is a very interesting problem from a policy perspective for economic growth. And then finally, are these in fact can these coexist? Are they all right at the same time? Or is this like the story of the blind man and the elephant? They're describing the same elephant in different ways because they can't really see the whole picture and they're looking at different parts of the same puzzle. Just to wrap up. So if you look at open, user, and cumulative innovation, they postulate some similar things about the role of knowledge in innovation, about the dispersal of that knowledge, and the importance of these flows of knowledge, whether they're as raw knowledge, whether there's IP, whether it's as products. And there's a clear recommendation for practice of innovation in the 21st century, which is to say that these innovation processes must focus outside the firm for knowledge and innovation. innovations in a way that perhaps vertically integrated firms 50 years ago would never have thought to do. Now, some of the differences are what are the sources of knowledge, how these knowledges flow, what are the motives for innovating, and thus what kind of incentives you want to provide. This is very much the Scotchmer space, which is to say, how do we design optimal incentives for innovation so that we get the most possible innovation? And then, frankly, both their processes and their assumptions and their values and their incentives kind of lead to different predictions about what sort of policy, particularly with regards to IP, is best. So my last slide, these are just sort of 3 ideas. If there are any doctoral students in the room, this is sort of something that we're always expected to do, is to suggest people of what they could go off and do. And one of them is the one I've been alluding to, which is to say, use these theories, apply it to the same phenomena, and try to see if one of them actually does a better job of explaining what's going on. A second one, which I'm really kind of excited about, and maybe this is my 4th or 5th paper in this stream, is this joint maximization problem. I mean, users are stakeholders, suppliers are stakeholders, universities are stakeholders, firms are stakeholders, competitors are stakeholders, complementers are stakeholders. So maybe there is some way we want to look at how do we make the overall system work in a smooth way so that all the different stakeholders get their interests met. I mean, if you take a user innovation perspective, you might say, oh, well, it's only the user's happiness that we care about. If you take an open innovation perspective, we want to say, well, it's the greedy firm at the center of this that we want to have success. And maybe we want to have some sort of study that incorporates these different perspectives for a joint maximization type solution. And then finally, I think maybe stepping back, and this is sort of the blue sky one, which is to say, all of these kind of raise questions about the scope of knowledge and the scope of innovation. I mean, where is this knowledge? Where is innovation happening? Where should it happen? And do we have boundaries between, say, organizations for knowledge? Are they the same as the boundaries for where innovation happens? Are they overlapping? Are they different? And sort of, then this comes back to a question that's really fairly central since the whole absorptive capacity literature came out in, it was 1990, I believe it is, which is to say, under what conditions do firms need to develop and have knowledge and have innovative capabilities, not to actually produce something directly, but for some other reason, in case of absorptive capacity, to understand the knowledge landscape. But in this case, one of the things that I worry about with the Chesborough book and open innovation is that a lot of firms are taking it as an excuse to say, oh, fire our R&D labs and outsource all R&D production to the cheapest possible outside supplier. And so the question is, there is some work that hints that that might not be the best solution, but we haven't really proved it. So under what conditions does a firm care about having knowledge inside the boundaries of the firm or ability to innovate inside the firm beyond this sort of narrow absorptive capacity issue? Because it's part of their role in the ecosystem and a part of their ability to succeed in this ecosystem depends on having some knowledge that is not necessarily something that perhaps they're commercializing directly. So it's a little after 3:10. I think we're on time, so thank you very much. Yes?
I have a question. It seems that a lot of companies actually is doing all 3 things at the same time, right? So a company could be doing relying on open innovation, user innovation, and also competitive innovation at the same time. So there's not necessarily a conflict between.
No, there isn't. I think one of the problems is, and this is one of the reasons why I'm working in this area, is that I think that there are, well, if you think about it from say a reality TV show standpoint, there are different tribes of innovation scholars. And they're rivalrous tribes with, I suppose, rivalrous information, non-rivalrous information. Anyway, so I think that the different stories are being told separately. But you're right, that the actual practice of innovation could be done jointly across all these different paradigms. And frankly, for some managers, they may not even care what it's called. They may just be trying to find the best solution. But the research on open innovation and the others seems to be kind of disjoint, and so therefore there's no, if you have a newly promoted product manager, you can't give them one book or one article that kind of brings this all together and say, well, if you're going to solve this kind of problem, you should go look at this stuff and you're going to solve this problem. But you're right, there's certainly no reason why a firm couldn't do all of these simultaneously. Yes?
I I think I can easily see the importance of knowledge in the society as a condition of boosting open innovation. The thing is, I'm from Korea, and my understanding is it is a society where the collaboration between entities is not very active,
Right.
the secrecy,
Right.
and where the entrepreneurial culture is not in place.
Exactly.
So if a firm in that kind of economy is trying to build open innovation into their organization, what are the things that a firm can do to boost that? Or is there any, I mean, if some bigger hand like government, do they add some kind of value to boost that open innovation among the economy?
Yeah, don't take this wrong, but it seems as though this vertically integrated model is sort of best suited for a developing economy, an economy that's not quite mature. And so if you look at Germany or the United States in the early 20th century, you don't really have these markets, you don't really have a vibrant ecosystem, and so firms are created to solve the problem and bring the technology to market. And the Japanese Zaibatsu and the banking groups and the Korean chaebol are very much in that model where we say, hey, we're going to create technology, we're going to bring it to market, we're going to get synergies across that. And certainly there is, as you allude to, there's a crowding out problem. That if the chaebol or the Japanese firm, the big Japanese multinationals are so powerful, it's very hard for a little firm to bring things to market. So on my blog, blog.openinnovation.net, I remarked with some amusement that a large Japanese company wanted to have an open innovation lab where they'd bring little small companies into the lab and pick their brains dry. And so so I think you're certainly right that both the government policy in Korea and to a large degree in Japan and in some aspects of Germany has been very much around this big centralized vertically integrated firm of the sorts that were successful after World War II. And I think maybe the best opportunity to do this would be to pick an example where the Korean firms don't have the knowledge inside the firm and therefore need to go outside for knowledge and recognize they need to go outside for knowledge and therefore to be part of the ecosystem. I mean, to some degree, if the Korean firms made personal computers, they're not really trying to be active in. The Japanese firms, to some degree, practice open innovation because they're buying operating systems and microprocessors from outside firms. They're not trying to control it end to end. On the other hand, the Korean firms, one time they tried it, it didn't work so well. They bought chips from Korea. They licensed from Qualcomm. They licensed IP from Qualcomm, and then they regretted it for the next 20 years. And so I think there's something in the DNA of these large Korean firms that they still want to control, and they still think they can control, and they don't want to share the spoils with little firms. They don't want to share the spoils with rivals or third parties. And so in that regard, they may have to do it. It may have to happen in an industry where they have no choice to be able to compete. So, for example, if you look at the computer industry, in 1980, 85, 90, with the exception of personal computers, pretty much anybody who made a computer made their own CPU. And gradually, over the last 20 years, they've all gotten out of the business of making their own CPU. Sun still does it. HP got out of it. IBM's sort of still in it. A number of firms that made their own CPU got out. They basically said, look, we don't have the scale economies to make our own CPUs. We're going to buy CPUs in the outside market because it's the only way we can afford to keep up. We don't have the scope to be able to support R&D. So maybe you need a market like that where the Korean firms basically have to join an open innovation ecosystem that already exists in order to be able to be successful. And maybe if someday LG or Samsung ship a phone with Symbian or with Android instead of their own software, that might be an example of something which would be an open innovation model.
So relatedly, I mean, would you, with respect to vertical integration, would you say that another issue that could crop up is capitalization and risk? So like with biotech firms being bought up by pharma. So would you say that that could also be sort of sort of the impetus for it?
Well, if you look at both the biotech story of the last 20 years and the sort of IT story of the last decade, you have a lot of innovative new startups that can't possibly build a vertically integrated firm from scratch in time to do it. I mean, yes, Amgen did it and Genentech did it, and there may be a couple, but in general, the barriers to entry are so high because the industry is so large and expensive that they have to basically go through somebody else. So to some degree, you've got one half of this IP market as a willing partner saying, I've got this innovation. I can't bring this innovation to market myself, and so I'm going to have to partner. Even in some of the chip companies, you know, say Atheros, which made Wi-Fi chips. You know, they made chips. They never made board. I don't think they made boards. They didn't certainly make radios. They didn't make modems. They didn't make personal computers. So they said, look, all we can do is a chip. And we're going to try to sell this chip to as many people as possible. And so, to some degree, what's been happening in Silicon Valley with sort of chip component abstraction model, modularity, has really been an open innovation story long before the term was coined. But you're right. Certainly biotech firms and to some degree firms with sort of one-trick ponies, little technologies, they can't vertically integrate. It's not really a viable option. And so they either, one, bring a product to market by licensing or selling to others, or two, and this is another sort of debate on the blog, if you get bought by Cisco, is that open innovation or vertical integration? Until you're bought, you're an outside technology supplier. But once you become part of the Cisco mothership, now all of a sudden it's just another example of Cisco-related diversification and vertical integration. So it's sort of it ceases being an open innovation story the minute the papers are, the ink is dry on the papers. Other questions or comments? Hey.
Two comments. One, I think, is to stay with the chips for a minute, looking at semiconductors. And if we stay within microprocessors, for example, you know, Intel, I think, has been following the vertical integration strategy. We're going to do our own chip design, we're going to do our own manufacturing, and to some degree our own assembly, test, packaging, and all the rest. And it's going to be a Pentium world, and nobody else can afford the scale to keep up with us if we're going to win just on sheer economies of scale.
Yeah.
And then other firms have been following, you know, the fabless model that was established in Taiwan,
Right.
which was economies of scope and of flexibility, so that instead of trying to build one kind of product in the factory, you have lots of different kinds of chips with following certain design constraints and design tools that could all be built on a common fab facility. You know, there were some differences across the products, and the production systems had to adjust to those. But you could never quite match Intel's cost per circuit, but you had so much more variety and heterogeneity that you were much more flexible and adaptive. And so that's an interesting example of sort of an open innovation kind of story, because this new division of labor emerged in the 80s between the vertically integrated manufacturer and the chip designer and the chip manufacturer, becoming separate entities now. And we've got Greg Linden here, who just finished a book on the chip industry and doing research in this area. So I thought we'd try to get Greg into the conversation a little bit as well.
My response to what you just said is that Intel and the fabless sector are apples and oranges, because Intel is really in IBM's neck of the woods, which is high performance computing. And so they're really interested in being able to integrate design and process to push to the absolute bleeding edge of what their process can do. And in the fabless sector, you're designing clever logic circuits that take advantage of the contract manufacturing available in Taiwan in order to do complementary things to the high performance chips. But they really have different objectives. I mean, so far, nobody has successfully competed in the microprocessor space with a fabless model.
Yeah,
How about in DRAMs? Aren't there some fabless DRAM companies now?
There were some fabless specialty DRAM producers in Taiwan. I guess there still are. But for the most part, DRAM is another story of where you need design and process very tightly aligned in order to get the smallest cell size.
So I think there's a really interesting point there on the chip thing, and I want to abstract it back to open innovation, which is to say we haven't had a lot of direct competition between the fabless specialty niche producers and the vertically integrated you know, economies of scale and you know, tight coupling stories. So, you know, AMD sounds like they're sort of going fabless, and
Yeah, but they own a big chunk of Global Foundries, so.
well, and it's also could be the last gasp of a dying, you know, a dying beast, and so it's not really clear if that's going to work. But we actually may see this with Qualcomm versus Intel, because they're increasingly competing, and so, you know, maybe the Intel people wouldn't be caught dead in the Qualcomm cafe over around the corner, because they've got a form of competition where they are cooperating in one area, but mostly competing in other areas. And so therefore, as their space starts to overlap more, maybe we'll have a more direct test, because Qualcomm is obviously very directly committed to the fabless model. They don't have that expertise. They don't want that expertise. But to sort of step back, I think you really hit on something that I hadn't thought about, but your and Ken's point, I think, links nicely together, which is I think open innovation depends on a pool of willing buyers and sellers. And I'm not sure that any of the others really have an assumption like that. You have a sort of a complementary dyadic model where you've got to have biotech companies and you've got to have big pharma who want to buy biotech. You've got to have fabless companies and you have to have companies that run fabs that are contract fab manufacturers. And the open innovation model of exchange really requires these two unlike types of parties, or complementary types of parties, to come to the table, whereas user innovation makes no such requirement. Cumulative innovation, we'll steal knowledge from anywhere. Our knowledge may leak out to anywhere. We don't really care the nature of the actors. So in that regard, I think there's something about, and this comes back to the sort of basic idea of open innovation, which tends to, but doesn't exclusively focus on this dyadic exchange, which is sort of the center of most of the open innovation research today. So. Other questions?
Oh, I had the second one I was going to put as well. That is, in these comparisons, I think there's an interesting dimension of the cross-sectional view versus the dynamic view over time. To me, the question in part is one of sustainability. One of the challenges, I think, to a world of free innovation is where does the seed corn come from? Anything that's capital intensive, that requires a lot of upfront investment, how do we get that? How do we sustain the system over time? I can see how the things get started and get initiated at the very, very earliest stages. But how do we scale them over time? I think it would be a very interesting one. And to me, I've teased Eric about this, but once you have rodeo kayaking or windsurfing or baby joggers, what have you, once they actually become large enough to become honest-to-gosh businesses, the user innovation literature typically loses interest at that point.
Exactly.
Because, and that's where it came from. It came from users. It didn't come from R&D labs. It came from users. But from that point forward, they actually do become businesses. They actually do have to worry about scaling up production, getting distribution channels, creating a business model that has to actually make some money to fund all these things. And that's where the user innovation community often loses interest. Now, so I think this dynamic view over time, there may be some life cycle aspects to it, different stages of the life cycle, different elements of these theories may have more or less to explain.
And cumulative innovation is kind of the same way. You know, once we figured out how to make a decent laser or a decent blast furnace, we kind of lose interest in the cumulative innovation story. So it's, you're absolutely right, and thank you, that's a wonderful insight, is the choice of time. I think, you know, if I could speak with a French accent, well, I would say that, well, you know, the European Commission should fund all great research and it should be owned by the people of Europe for the benefit of European companies to make European jobs in Europe. And so the central state planning model might be that the seed corn is a function of government, because in fact there are spillovers and this is non-rivalrous knowledge and we want to make it available. But then of course, in a global world, how do you make sure that the money done by American universities with American taxpayer dollars has some benefit for American firms, or French universities, or Chinese universities, or whatever. So I think in the old model, you know, Merton or Paul David talking about the 1900s, you might have a model where the Crown supports university research and it accrues to the benefit of local firms. And the problem, of course, now with the internet is that you can't control the spillovers of this pool of knowledge that you funded, and so therefore, why should the government fund it if in fact it's not going to accrue to the benefit of its taxpayers? And so this is sort of a problem of open science that hasn't been fixed, which is a lot of the nostalgia for open science applies to a world where, in fact, you could sort of shape or funnel the spillovers, because it would be interpersonal interchange by a scientist and an entrepreneur who lived within 10 miles of each other. And now once that information goes on the internet, the economic arguments for funding this non-rivalrous knowledge kind of go away.
I hadn't thought of it, but I think you could date the heyday of open science back to the cumulative innovation story, because I think it was the launch of Sputnik that gave rise to this massive infusion of federal funding for research, not only in the natural and physical sciences, but also in the social sciences. So we had a period in the 60s and the 70s going on into the 80s where the federal government massively increased research funding, and so we had a period where there was a lot of public knowledge being generated and funded out of essentially rivalry. Not in those days, rivalry with the Soviet
At the
Union.
national level, yes.
And now with the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of that rival, we've lost that impetus or that force. And so now we read these stories about we're not putting enough into education, we're underfunding our schools and all the rest. And the reason those schools got so well funded was not out of some high ideal of citizen democracy, but was out of the fear of being out-competed in the race for space.
Well, this is sort of the classic question if you're a David Mowry PhD student, which is, we can't bring back the good old days. So if the government isn't going to throw buckets of money at universities to do innovation, and if firms are getting rid of their R&D labs, and so they're not going to do innovation, well, where is this R&D going to be done? Where are all the PhD scientists and engineers going to get jobs to create the next internet or create the next recombinant DNA if, in fact, that this funding doesn't happen? Now, fortunately, IT is a mature industry, so maybe we don't need that much funding. And I think NIH is probably the closest thing we have to something that's continuing to fund this sort of research. And I think until human bodies last, I don't know, 150, 200 years, there probably will be something like an NIH that will be funding this kind of stuff for a while longer. So I think there'll still be some pockets of spillovers, but you're right. For a lot of industries, that gravy train is long since passed.
Well, Joel, thank you very much. So 3 final announcements. 1, don't forget the blog. Lots of good information here. Secondly, next week, we're going to have as our speaker Judy Estrin. Wonderful person, very, very smart, knowledgeable, very successful person in the industry, really sharp and smart on innovation issues as well. So it'll be more of an industry focus, but boy, it'll be a great talk. So if you can come, please check that out.
You're going to mention Judy's pedigree, that her parents were computer science professors, and her sister is a UCLA computer science professor, so she's sort of has one foot in academia and probably maybe a bigger foot in industry.
I was saving that for next week, but that's and where did my list go?
It's right here.
Fantastic. Did everybody get on the list? So I have everybody's email for announcements and such? Okay, let's catch up at the class. Thank you all very much.